The three of us, me, Liam, and Nora, had been planning this hike for weeks. We wanted a real escape from the chaos of the city, something raw, primal. There was an old campsite deep in the woods, far from any trails. It was miles from the nearest town, barely even on the map. The kind of place you had to navigate to by feel as much as by compass. It was perfect. We hiked all day, our packs weighing us down, but the air was fresh and cool, and the trees pressed in thickly around us, swallowing every sound except our own footfalls and breath. By the time we reached the clearing, the sky was already turning a smoky gray, and a slight chill had settled over the forest. We set up our tents and got a small fire going, relieved by the warmth. Shadows stretched, twisting and bending in the flickering light. It wasn't long before we started telling scary stories. Liam went first, spinning a tale about an old man who supposedly haunted these woods, said to roam in search of his lost daughter. I laughed it off, but Nora looked unsettled, her eyes darting past us to the darkness beyond the trees. My turn was next, and I decided to tell a story I'd heard about a creature called the Rake. I'd read about it on some forum late one night, one of those tales that sticks in your mind and makes the shadows seem deeper when the lights are out. I told them about the creature's pale, thin limbs, its hollow, dark eyes, and the way it supposedly watches people while they sleep. Liam laughed and shook his head, muttering something about urban legends, but I could see Nora visibly tense. Just as I was describing the creature's eerie, almost human shape, we heard a soft rustling from the bushes. It was faint, like a branch shifting, and stopped almost as soon as it had started. We went silent, each of us staring in the direction of the sound. The fire crackled in the quiet, and the darkness beyond our small circle seemed to press in closer. Probably just a raccoon, Liam said, forcing a laugh. But then the rustling came again, closer this time. Nora's eyes went wide, and her hand shot out to grab my arm. I could feel her fingers trembling slightly. Let's just check it out, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We grabbed our flashlights, each of us straining to see beyond the firelight. As we moved closer to the edge of the clearing, the noise stopped. It was dead silent, the kind of silence that blankets everything and makes even the tiniest sound unbearable. I could feel my heart pounding, and the hair on the back of my neck prickled. Then we saw them, tracks, strange, elongated prints in the dirt near the bushes. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Each print was about the size of a human hand but stretched, the fingers or toes clawed and too long. They weren't like any animal tracks I recognized, nor were they human. The shape was wrong, unnatural. What could have made these? Nora whispered, her voice barely audible. Liam, usually the most skeptical of us, had gone pale. He shook his head slowly, not answering, his eyes fixed on the tracks. But I forced myself to stay calm, rationalizing that it had to be a bear or some other animal that had just left oddly shaped prints. The tracks, whatever had made them, had been watching us from the bushes. It had been creeping closer, just outside the firelight. And as I traced the tracks with my eyes, I realized something else. They were far apart, almost impossibly so, as though whatever had made them had taken huge, unnatural strides. It was moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. Liam's flashlight beam flickered, and we jumped as the shadows leaped and twisted. The rustling returned, closer now, circling us. It was coming from multiple directions, the sound of something, or several somethings, skittering through the underbrush. Liam took a deep breath, clearly trying to mask his fear, and muttered, "I'll check it out. Probably just, I don't know, maybe a fox or something." He forced a grin, though his eyes betrayed him, darting nervously toward the trees. We watched as he stepped closer to the bushes, his flashlight beam quivering as he scanned the dense, shifting shadows. Every step he took felt wrong somehow, as if he were crossing an invisible line. The firelight only barely reached him now, and beyond that small pool of light, the darkness seemed almost alive. It swallowed his form, leaving only the small halo of his flashlight piercing through. Liam crept closer, the beam tracing over branches and leaves that hung like skeletal fingers, reaching out of the dark. His breath was loud, each exhale trembling in the silence. Then, with one last step, he stopped abruptly. We waited, our eyes fixed on him, nerves stretched to breaking point. There's nothing here, he called back, sounding almost relieved. But even as he said it, his light fell on the ground near the bushes, and I saw his face change. First confusion, then something darker, an expression that I can only describe as dread. He crouched down, his fingers hovering over the ground, just above something we couldn't see from where we stood. Liam? What is it? Nora's voice was barely a whisper. He straightened up slowly, shining the light back toward us. In that small beam, I saw it more of those twisted, elongated tracks, each one imprinted clearly in the damp earth, leading into the clearing and out again. They seemed fresher this time, as if something had been standing there, watching moments before he arrived. Same prints, he said, his voice flat, hollow. They're everywhere. We exchanged looks, none of us willing to say what we were thinking. But we knew, deep down, that whatever this thing was, it wasn't afraid of us. It was playing with us, testing how close it could get. We should make torches, I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. If it's an animal, it'll be afraid of fire. Most things are. My voice shook slightly, but I forced myself to stand up straighter, not wanting them to see how scared I was. Liam and Nora nodded, grasping onto the idea as though it were a lifeline. We gathered around the fire, ripping off long branches from a nearby fallen tree and wrapping the ends with scraps of cloth from an old bandana I had in my pack. We soaked the ends in whatever fuel we could scavenge from our lighter fluid and the remains of our campfire oil. Liam, torch in hand, looked around the clearing, his eyes steely, though his hand trembled slightly. Let's split up a little. Just stay close enough to see each other, he suggested, his voice a strained mix of bravery and fear. The plan was simple. Search the perimeter, maybe scare off whatever was lurking out there, and hopefully catch a glimpse of it if it tried to move. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. We fanned out, each of us with a makeshift torch held high, the flames casting long, twisting shadows across the trees. I moved carefully, listening for any noise, any hint of movement. Every crunch of leaves underfoot sounded deafening, as though the entire forest could hear us. Every now and then, I caught a glimpse of Liam or Nora through the trees, their flames bobbing in the darkness like ghostly lanterns. Then came that sound again, a faint skittering, moving rapidly between us, circling as though testing our boundaries. My heart pounded, each beat echoing in my ears as I tightened my grip on the torch, holding it out like a shield. A branch cracked to my left, sharp and deliberate. I swung the torch around, its glow barely reaching the edges of the forest, but I saw nothing, only the dark, pressing in thicker than ever. The fire in my hand felt small, almost useless, against the oppressive weight of the night. Do you see anything? Liam's voice cut through the silence, tense and low. No, Nora called back, her voice trembling. Nothing, but I hear it. It's close, I think. I swallowed hard, glancing toward her, and that's when I saw it. Another track, this one only a few steps from where she stood. I was about to shout a warning when I noticed something worse. The track was facing directly toward her, like a set of footprints frozen mid-step. Nora, don't move. She looked at me, confused, but didn't take a step. What is it? Just look down, I said, forcing the words out. Her gaze shifted slowly to the ground, and I saw her eyes widen as they settled on the print, fresh and clear in the dirt, angled toward her as if something had been just behind her and slipped back into the shadows. She let out a shaky breath, her face paling in the torchlight. Without a word, she backed up, coming closer to where I stood. What is this thing? The question hung in the air, unanswered. But as we stood there, I felt something shift, an almost imperceptible drop in the temperature, a heaviness that seemed to wrap around us like a shroud. The forest, once full of distant sounds, had gone utterly silent. Even the rustling had stopped, leaving nothing but the crackle of our torches. And then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, a low, guttural sound broke the silence. A sound like a twisted imitation of a human voice, a faint, rasping laugh. It was mocking, almost delighted, as though whatever was out there knew we were trapped and afraid. The sound rippled through me, chilling me to the core, and for the first time, I truly felt like we were being hunted. We need to get out of here. Liam nodded, his face pale, and Nora looked on the verge of tears, but none of us moved. The woods around us seemed darker, denser, as if the trees themselves were leaning in, watching. We exchanged a last silent glance, a wordless agreement. We had to get out of these woods, fast. The twisted, silent trees loomed above us, as if closing in, but we couldn't waste another moment. We doused our torches, letting them smolder out so we wouldn't accidentally start a forest fire, though a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that we might regret losing even that little bit of light. "Let's go," I said, forcing the words past the knot in my throat. But even as I spoke, I saw Liam hesitate, his eyes scanning the darkness one last time, as though trying to make sense of the creature that had been stalking us. Before any of us could move, a blur of pale, bony limbs burst from the bushes to our left, crossing the space between us and Liam in a heartbeat. It happened so fast I barely registered what I was seeing. The thing that came from the shadows wasn't fully human. It was elongated, almost insect-like, with arms and legs too long, too thin, bending in unnatural angles. Its skin was an eerie shade of gray, stretched taut over sharp, jutting bones, and it was naked yet androgynous, almost mannequin-like. His face, I can barely even call it that. Where eyes should have been, there were two sunken pits, endless black holes that stared at Liam with a malevolent hunger. The mouth was a slash of shadow, too wide, with faint traces of something sharp glinting within as it opened, letting out that same raspy, inhuman laugh. It leapt onto Liam, faster than anything I'd ever seen, its limbs wrapping around him like a grotesque spider. Liam let out a strangled shout, his arms flailing as he tried to fight it off, but the creature's limbs held him tightly, its weight bearing him down. I saw his face for a split second, his expression a twisted mixture of terror and confusion, and then he disappeared beneath it, his struggling slowing as the thing sank lower, pressing him into the dirt. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Nora's arm as she stood frozen, her eyes wide and glazed with shock. She stumbled at first, but then her feet caught, and together we bolted into the darkness, not daring to look back. Behind us, the rustling grew louder, as though several somethings, were following, their skittering movements echoing Liam's last, horrified sounds. Branches slapped against our faces and snagged at our clothes as we stumbled through the trees, driven by nothing but pure fear. The world narrowed to the pounding of our feet and the ragged gasps of our breath. Our senses stretched thin, alert to every crack, every rustle in the darkness. It felt like the forest itself was alive, twisting and closing around us as we ran, the trees blurring into one another like shadows. The creature tore Liam apart. That thought hit me like a punch to the chest, nearly stopping me in my tracks. But I forced myself to keep going, my grip on Nora's arm the only thing anchoring me to reality. We didn't speak. There was no time, no breath to spare. We just ran, the only goal to get as far from that clearing as possible, to put distance between us and that thing. But even as we ran, the soft, mocking laughter followed us, weaving through the trees, growing fainter, then closer, as though the creature or creatures were playing with us, drawing us deeper into the dark. We ran until our bodies gave out, lungs burning, muscles aching, feet stumbling over roots and stones. My legs finally buckled, and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. Nora was right beside me, her face pale, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. My entire body was trembling, and my heart was hammering so hard that I could barely hear anything beyond its frantic beat. But that moment of rest, that single pause to catch our breath, was all it took. Before I could react, something pale and silent blurred from the trees, leaping onto Nora with an animalistic speed that made my mind go blank with terror. I froze, horror-stricken, as I watched it unfold. The creature's skeletal limbs wrapped around her like twisted ropes, pulling her down to the forest floor. She let out a scream, a piercing, desperate sound that broke off suddenly as the thing clamped its hand over her mouth, silencing her with inhuman efficiency. I could only stare, rooted to the spot, every instinct in me wanting to pull her free, to do something, anything, but fear held me hostage. Nora's wide, pleading eyes found mine, and I felt a sickening twist of guilt and helplessness. The creature's face was close to hers, so close that I could see its hollow, dark eyes, unblinking, and that slash of a mouth stretched into an eerie, empty grin. I could feel it watching me even as it held her down, as if it were savoring my fear. And then it did something I'll never forget. It tilted its head and let out that raspy, mocking laugh again, low and distorted, like it was mimicking the sound of a person, savoring every second of the horror it was creating. I don't know what broke me out of my frozen trance. Maybe it was the animalistic fear, the instinct to survive kicking in. Whatever it was, I suddenly found strength I didn't know I had. My feet moved on their own. I was alone now, plunged into a nightmare that was all too real. It felt like a horror movie, every frantic step a desperate fight for survival, but I knew that I wasn't going to wake up. I wasn't safe. And then, as I tore through the underbrush, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The creature couldn't have reached us so quickly from the clearing. It had stayed behind with Liam and then with Nora, which meant there had to be more than one. There were two of them. The realization sank in like a knife, and I knew that stopping or even slowing down wasn't an option. I had to find somewhere they couldn't reach me, somewhere out of their reach. Ahead, I spotted a massive, ancient tree, its branches stretching high and wide, rising like a dark fortress against the night sky. Without thinking, I made for it, my legs somehow finding new strength in the face of the only hope I had. I scrambled up the rough bark, my hands gripping onto anything they could find, my feet slipping on mossy patches as I hoisted myself higher and higher. The climb was brutal. My hands were raw, my legs shaking, and my entire body felt like it was on fire. But I forced myself to keep going, driven by the primal need to survive. The branches grew thinner as I went up, but I kept climbing, pushing until I was as high as I could go without the branches breaking under my weight. Finally, I found a thick bough and pressed myself against the trunk, gasping, my body trembling as I tried to calm my breathing. The forest stretched out below me, dark and unfathomable, every shadow a potential hiding place for those things. I sat in silence, pressing my back against the rough bark, my chest heaving as I tried to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. The only thing I could hear was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind and the blood pounding in my ears. Then, below me, I caught a flicker of movement, pale and silent, weaving through the trees with that same unnatural, fluid grace. My heart clenched as I watched one of them emerge into the clearing near the base of my tree, its elongated limbs gliding through the shadows with a precision that seemed almost deliberate. It moved slowly, as if it knew I was up here, as if it was just waiting. I sat on that branch, pressed against the rough bark, as dawn slowly crept over the forest, transforming the shadows into shapes that finally made sense. The creatures had moved back into the depths of the trees sometime in the early hours, their eerie, hollow eyes never leaving me until they dissolved into the darkness. They slipped away without a sound, leaving nothing but silence and the faint rustle of leaves where they'd been. For what felt like hours, I stayed frozen, my whole body stiff and aching, terrified that even the slightest movement would draw them back. When the first rays of sunlight pierced through the branches, casting streaks of pale light over the forest floor, I felt something inside me shift. With every bit of strength I had left, I climbed down from the tree, my limbs numb and unsteady as I touched the ground. I knew I had no time to hesitate. I had to get out of that forest. I ran, faster than I thought my body was capable of, ignoring the scrapes and bruises, the aching of my legs, the gnawing hunger. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't want to think about what might still be lingering in the shadows, watching me leave. I didn't want to think about Nora and Liam, about what I had left behind. I didn't have to. Some part of me already knew they were gone. Eventually, I reached the edge of the forest. The air felt different, lighter, as if I'd crossed some invisible boundary between their world and ours. It was only then that I allowed myself to stop, collapsing onto the grass, breathless and trembling, my mind a blur of relief and horror. Somehow I'd survived. When I finally made it back to town, I went to the police, numb and exhausted. I told them what I could, the parts one could explain without sounding insane. I told them we'd been hiking, that we'd gotten separated, that some kind of animal had attacked us in the night. They took me seriously at first. Search parties were sent into the forest, and a few days later, they found the bodies of Nora and Liam. Torn, broken, their injuries so brutal that they chalked it up to a bear or some other predator. But I knew better. I knew what I'd seen in the dark, what I'd left behind in those woods. I tried to explain once, my voice barely more than a whisper, but the officers just gave me pitying looks, dismissing it as the trauma of losing my friends, a product of my distressed state of mind. No one believed me, and after a while I stopped trying to convince them. I stopped talking about it entirely, stopped letting the words come out. Even my own mind refused to fully grasp it, as though some part of me wanted to erase that night, to pretend it hadn't happened.